And we begin with Russia's war in Ukraine, which has now lasted more than 3 weeks, displacing 3 million people and killing thousands, including hundreds of civilians, likely more. Delegations from Moscow and Kyiv have been meeting all week, and both sides indicate that discussions are progressing toward an agreement to end the fighting. In what is perhaps an indication of where ceasefire talks are headed, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky conceded on Tuesday that Ukraine will likely not be a member of NATO. That is a retreat from the position firmly held by his government and NATO itself as recently as last December during a joint press conference with Zelensky amid the Russian troop buildup at the border. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reiterated that the military alliance is keen on Ukraine joining.
I was actually present at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 when all allies agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And we stand by that decision and decisions taken after the Bucharest summit on the issue of Ukraine's possibility to become a NATO member.
Also, Ukraine's constitution still has a provision requiring the government to seek full membership in NATO. So this has been a major sticking point in the conflict. It doesn't justify a Russian invasion at all, but still, it's been a sticking point in negotiations that's less stuck now, let's say. Financial Times reported that a 15-point plan for peace was nearing consensus among negotiators. Under it, Ukraine would not join NATO and would not host any foreign military bases nor certain weapons systems. In exchange, Ukraine would be able to seek out security guarantees from individual countries in the West. Beyond neutrality, the Kremlin is also still asking for more concessions than the government in Kyiv is willing to accept right now, including land concessions in Crimea and the Donbass. But talks are moving in a, quote, more realistic direction, according to Zelensky. While peace talks progress, there is a parallel effort to expand the war. Zelensky gave a speech to the United States Congress on Wednesday calling on the U.S. to close the skies over Ukraine, basically enact a no-fly zone, which is an extremely risky operation that would likely lead to a direct war between the U.S. and Russia and possibly a nuclear exchange. Zelensky is also calling on the U.S. to supply fighter jets, which the Pentagon has also assessed as high risk, since it would require delivering the planes into Ukraine somehow, into an active war zone, which could also be interpreted by the Russians as provocative. After Zelensky's speech, President Joe Biden did sign off on giving another $800 million in military assistance to Ukraine. It includes more anti-tank rockets, plus some new anti-aircraft missiles and drones. Now, it's worth noting that the White House and the vast majority of lawmakers in Washington do understand the risks of a no-fly zone in Ukraine and are so far resisting the calls from Zelensky, from the Beltway press, from hawkish think tanks, the military-industrial complex, to set one up. There are always cranks, and we did learn the identity of one of them who is pushing for a no-fly zone to be set up using electromagnetic pulses. It's Rep. Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican representing Pennsylvania's 1st District. CNN reporter tweeted that Fitzpatrick said that through technology like sonar radar and electromagnetic pulses, the U.S. could enforce a no-fly zone. But he also acknowledged that there's a risk of that technology falling into someone else's hands. Ah, yes, don't want the plane grounding sonar weapons to fall into the wrong hands. Imagine if our adversaries have that, and the microwave gun that causes Havana syndrome. We'd be doomed. This war needs to end, not just on behalf of Ukrainian civilians whose lives are being destroyed, but also because of observers in the West and U.S. lawmakers who are losing their goddamn minds. As expected, the Federal Reserve announced an increase in interest rates on Wednesday, the first since 2018. The so-called federal funds rate was hiked 1/4 of a point to a range of 0.25 and 0.5%, after being as low as possible during the worst days of the pandemic. Members of the so-called Federal Open Markets Committee also said in a survey that they expect interest rates to be increased 6 more times by the end of the year, meaning that credit will be more expensive in U.S. capital markets. Inflation is the target. Employment will be collateral damage. Here was Fed Chair Jerome Powell answering a question about how this hike will increase unemployment.
How do higher Fed rates reduce consumer demand unless it's through higher unemployment? Thank you.
Well, if you take a look at today's labor market, what you have is 1.7 plus job openings for every unemployed person. So that's a very, very tight labor market, tight to an unhealthy level, I would say. So, in principle, if let's say that our tools work about as you described, and the idea is we're trying to better align demand and supply, let's just say in the labor market. So it would actually, if you were just moving down the number of job openings so that they were more like 1-to-1, you would have less upward pressure on wages.
In other words, pay workers less. You know, to the extent that we have a planned economy in the US, we don't, but any semblance of one that we do have comes from the Fed. And right now, it's orienting the economy to hurt workers. And Jerome Powell is just fucking admitting it. And finally, one of the best to ever do it, Scott Hall, died this week. He was 63 years old. Some might know him from his work at WWE as Razor Ramon, a drug trafficking Cuban American. Hall wasn't even Hispanic, but he was so good as a heel in it that no one cared and everyone loved him. Others might know him from his groundbreaking stint at WCW, where he played himself as an outsider alongside Kevin Nash, founding the insurgent NWO, wreaking havoc on the entire wrestling scene. As an 11-year-old in the 90s, it was probably the coolest thing I'd ever seen on TV. Scott Hall did that. I was lucky enough to get a chance to watch him wrestle back in the summer of 1996 at the Ocean Center in Daytona at the Bash at the Beach. That's me right there in the front row with my mom. You know, I didn't realize until I was older and watched these guys that I cheered for every week grow old themselves and face health complications and lack of support, just how exploited they were. Treated not as employees, but independent contractors instead, wrestlers were paid when they could generate profit for the company and then quickly cast aside, broken when they couldn't. Hall struggled in his later years, like so many of his era did. Jake the Snake, Kamala, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, just to name a few of the stars of 90s wrestling that had to raise money online later to pay basic medical bills because capitalists like Vince McMahon never gave a shit about them. Scott Hall was forced to crowdfund medical bills in 2013 to mend the damages to his hip inflicted through decades of work in the ring. He got the money, got the surgery, and got his life back together. But Hall can never quite get his hip right, and he died of complications during surgery trying to replace it. Fellow wrestling star Bret Hart released a statement after Hall's passing, talking about what a talent Hall was. Hart noted, though, that so many wrestlers from his era have met premature deaths. I won't blame any one thing, he said, but I do believe that if the days of wrestling 300 days a year had been kinder and more considerate, if we could have been home with our loved ones more, many of my old friends and brothers would still be here. I don't have much else to say. Scott Hall was one of my favorites growing up. He died a legend. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Also, if you want to see Means Morning News in its complete form, not just the clips we post here, head on over to Means TV and get access to all our new episodes and our entire backlog, plus tons of other great movies and original TV shows.